Okay, so I finished James Howard Kunstler's World Made by Hand series. It's a series of 4 books set in a post industrial United States. I figured that this would be a great match because, I talk about the collapse of industrial civilization a lot, and these books detail a collapse of industrial civilization and what it would look like locally within New England and in the third book throughout the rest of the United States. But before I get to the books themselves, I want to talk about Kunstler a little bit. Kunstler is, one of the big people within this collapse. I don't know if I want to call it community or theorizing or whatever. Um, he's been at it since 93, at least since the early 2000s. Now, going back to him, he was born in New York in 1949. He is a New York Jew. He's non practicing. Initially, he was a popular columnist and then became a staff writer for the Rolling Stones magazine. And then in the 1980s, he began writing novels, which none of these really caught on very well. But the book that kind of made his career and would orient that career for the rest of his life, really, is The Geography to Nowhere, which is a book that talks about suburbia and urban planning. It's very, very anti cars, very anti suburbs, and it just details about the inefficiency of it and how America made very poor plans in sprawling its cities out, especially in the western United States, and how it's just a very efficient thing. And as he would go on, he would latch on to the peak oil community, and the anti-suburb thing, the anti-car thing, lends itself into the peak oil thing. And as such, he released in 2005 The Long Emergency, which really is a classic of the collapse worldview, the collapse theory, resource scarcity, and its consequences and how this will likely lead to the collapse of industrial society. And this was in the middle of the peak oil movement. At the same time, he had Clusterfuck Nation, which is his blog, which continues to this day. And this was kind of his peak of popularity, the 2000s. And then in the 2010s, of course, we get the oil glut and the idea that peak oil isn't a real threat, that we're going to be able to effectively use shales, or that we're going to move into electric vehicles, right? And now it's kind of like this is this weird thing that they believed in the 2000s, that they would run out of oil. But he didn't give up on his worldview, so he continued to write more nonfiction books. So you have Too Much Magic and 2012, which further criticized you know, technology and the idea of infinite innovation, right? And then I think it was 2019 or 2020 itself, he wrote the sequel, Living in the Long Emergency, which to many ways is an update. It talks about the inefficiencies of electric vehicles. It talks about how shale is a short boom and that it will probably bust in the near future. And it was really ominous when it came out because it came right on the cusp of the coronavirus pandemic and the chaos that's come afterwards. And I just finished reading that second book. And the second book is really good. A lot of it details how he meets up with people who have followed his blogs and followed his books that he's had correspondence with. And he interviews them and he talks about how they will adapt to peak oil. Now, while all this was going on, he wrote these 4 novels, The World Made by Hand, where he details how people would adapt in a world without fossil fuels, but really without electricity, because World Made by Hand goes back a lot with technology. Now, with Kunstler, he was a moderate Democrat at the beginning, and as time has gone on, he's moved rightwards. So right now he's very anti-vaccines, very anti-lockdown, into the shandemic or plandemic type of mindset, where he's very, very critical of the policy surrounding the coronavirus pandemic. But before that, he was initially didn't support Trump, but he became supportive of Trump following the Russiagate stuff and learning of the FBI's illegal activity to monitor Trump, the NSA's illegal activity to monitor the Trump campaign in 2016, and he shifted towards supporting Trump and these populists. And he's kind of, he's not far right, right? He's not a nationalist or an ethnic nationalist or whatever, but he is a very truthful and resilient man in the sense that he won't bow to public pressure. He's going to believe what he's going to believe, regardless of its effects on his life, his career, and his status within the community at large that talks about collapse, or the writing community. And because of that, he's garnered a lot of enemies. And now, if you go on like Wikipedia, right, it's this huge, venomous screed against him, calling him a conspiracy theorist and fearmonger and stuff, because even though he's not far right, just by taking his firm stand to the right of the regime, he becomes an enemy just as much as everybody further to the right of him. And to give him credit, in Living in the Long Emergency, he doesn't punch right that much. He gives a white nationalist follower of him, he gives an interview with him, and he lets them have a platform in that kind of sense. He's not pro-deplatforming the far right, always punching to the right. He's a very free speech guy, very alt-light, if you will, very classical liberal, and against corruption, against authoritarianism. But that's not really why you're reading him, at least for me. I'm reading him for his theories of peak oil, peak resources, resource scarcity, and his examination of that. And then he fleshes that out into kind of a real-world scenario through this novel series, A World Made by Hand. Now, before we tackle the plots of the books, there's something that's kind of really important with them, and that's the question of genre. The novels are set in a world which is facing a radical decentralization, in which electronic energy has essentially been cut off permanently, and the book is centered on a small town in upstate New York called Union Grove, which despite some problems seems to be transitioning well into a deindustrial agricultural state. At first glance, these books, you would put them within the dystopian subgenre of science fiction, yet I kind of think that's problematic as there's no advancement in technology. It's rather a lack of technology, so could you really call it science fiction? And it's also not necessarily dystopian. A society or its political structures aren't oppressive or generally a problem here. And most of the books actually center around crime and how the community will solve these crimes and put their perpetrators to justice. So in this sense, these books are actually small town crime books, and where there's kind of the speculative fiction background. But before I even get into that, it's important to note that there's actually a lot of supernatural activity that occurs within them. There's a witch, and then there's a clairvoyant, and a mind-reading pastor, and premonitions, and all kinds of stuff like that. It's a low fantasy world. So ultimately, it's like a low fantasy book in the background, a dystopian book in the background, but the plot is centered around crimes within a small town, if that makes sense. There are 4 books in the series. The first was World Made by Hand, which came out in 2008, then Witch of Hebron, 2010, A History of the Future, 2015, and The Heroes of Spring, 2016. It's important to note that all these books have multiple plot lines, and they follow a series of characters in every single book. And these characters get added on, and then there's more and more characters. So if you wanted to jump, I think some people are going to end up being interested from this video in A History to the Future, because that's where he details what's happened to America and somewhat the world at large. That's where he details it. So I assume a lot of my fans are going to be a lot more interested in this book, because it's more speculative fiction, it's more political science, it's more what would happen, it's more of that dystopia than the first two. But you really can't do that because all of these build on each other, and it's really, there's not any single plot in any of these books. It's really a series of characters within one town where they have intersecting plots. And all these books actually take place within a short time. They're all within a single year. So World by Hand is set within the summer, Witch of Hebron is set in the fall, around Halloween. A History of the Future is set during the winter. It begins on Christmas Eve and then continues through into like January. And then The Heroes of Spring is set during the spring, right? At when everything thaws and, right when they're planting, but they can't get any food. And that's part of that book, is the crisis of this late winter, early spring planting period where they're not able to harvest anything yet. So, World Made by Hand, the first book, which came out in 2008, and that's the book which Kunstler names the whole series after. So if you're going to get the audiobooks, which are all free if you have a subscription on Audible, they're all called A World by Hand. That's the series that Kunstler has decided to name it. I thought, if he would have named it Union Grove series or something like that, that would have made more sense instead of, name it after the first book, but whatever. So it takes place in the summer of a not-so-distant future. He's very smart in that he doesn't give any hard dates or anything like that. So it could be set within, because it's written in 2008, it could be presumably set within the 2010s, or, we could assume that it takes place in the 2020s. In this book, there's kind of like 3 or 4 main plot lines. This one is the only one that is really centered around a main character. And Robert Earl shares a lot of stuff with Kunstler. For instance, he's a musician. Kunstler's a musician. So he's the main character of the first book, and it's actually, most of it is from his first-person perspective. The rest of the books are going to be third-person perspective. But this one is first-person perspective from Robert Earl, who's the main character of this total book. In the other books, he's the most important or a very important character in all the succeeding books, but here he's the main character. He's a former software company executive, and now he's a journeyman carpenter. He originally was living in Boston, and then he's a masshole that moved out to upstate New York. And he got stuck there when oil ran out, and he transitioned into becoming a carpenter. He's also a fiddler for a string band. Remember, he's a musician. And that string band is at the Congregational Church, which the pastor is his best friend. And we'll get to him later, Lauren Holder. But anyway, he plays traditional American pop songs and folk songs in a string band. At the beginning of the book, he's going to a dump which this man called Wayne Karp runs a gang and then excavates from the city dump and takes the metals and stuff out, and everything that's not completely broken, and like metal hinges, nails, stuff like that, and creates a salvage yard which he sails out of, I think of like a former storefront, kind of like a flea market, and he sells it back to the town. Because the United States is collapsed and there's no more manufactured goods, they don't have like a metal foundry, so the only way that they can get like metal supplies is through Wayne Karp. So he's going there with his neighbor, who's also part of his string band. He goes in to buy some nails. His neighbor's waiting on the outside with his pet dog. There's a confrontation. He comes outside after hearing some gunshots and finds out a gang member under Wayne Karp has killed his band member. So Earl, seeing this and being kind of the only witness to this, tries to go back to Union Grove and have an investigation of the murder. The town is terrified of Wayne Karp and refuses to investigate the murder. And it's revealed during this town meeting, which Earl calls, Robert Earl, that a new cult called the New Faith Brethren have actually purchased, through very dubious means, the town's high school, which has been abandoned because the teachers, there's no way to pay the teachers, and the high school, you know, high schools, public schools, elementary schools, middle schools, there's a lot of upkeep to those buildings, especially with heating. So the high school's been abandoned. So they purchased through very dubious means this high school, and this cult settles there, the New Faith Brethren. So this town meeting discusses the New Faith Brethren, and it discusses this murder of Earl's bandmate. So anyway, what ends up happening is the mayor resigns, and the town council says, well, fuck you, Robert Earl. You're going to be the mayor. And Robert Earl is made the mayor, and then his best friend, Lauren Holder, who's a congregational pastor, is elected as the town's constable. Now, this is really weird. I don't understand why they have a constable. Maybe it's an East Coast thing, or it's a new upstate New York or New England thing. But, you know, I live in Montana. We have sheriffs. They're elected. They're sheriffs are a big deal in American history. Big deal in the West. So I really don't understand why they have a constable as opposed to a sheriff. But anyway, he basically is the only person who's a lawman. And he's also this congregational pastor, and he's a liberal Christian. And we'll talk about Kunstler's weird understanding of Christianity and how it's kind of a negative aspect of these books when I get through the rest of the books. So anyway, Lauren and Robert are going to figure out the murder, and they're going to try and resolve what's going on with the cult. At the same time, there's this man called Stephen Bullock who runs kind of like this feudal estate. His family has been running an apple orchard which creates cider for generations. And when the industrial economy collapses, he transitions this huge apple cider orchard into a feudal estate. And he's kind of the only person who's able to trade with the outside world. What he does is he sends boats down, paddle boats down the Houston River to Albany to trade for goods from his apple cider orchard for trade goods. Then he sells them back into the town. Now he's the most powerful person in the entire county. But the thing about it is that they elected a magistrate because of how powerful he is. But he doesn't want to serve as magistrate. So the town council tries to force him to do something about the murder. And when they do this, they find out that his paddle boat has been kidnapped in Albany. So the cult, seeing this opportunity and seeing a way to make friends with the rest of the town of Union Grove, they set up an exposition of their members who are former veterans to go down to Albany, find out what's happened to the paddle boat team and the paddle boat, and then get it back to Union Grove. Robert Earl joins this exposition. They go down to Albany. They find out that the town is under control of like a city boss who is he's just kidnapping and holding the paddle boatmen for ransom. Rather than paying the ransom, the exposition kills the city boss and several of his henchmen, frees the paddlemen, takes the boat, then heads back to Union Grove. At the same time, Robert Earl, who again is the main character, is very curious what's going on with America because they don't have electricity anymore. They're not receiving any news in upstate New York. All he knows about is what's happened months and months ago or years ago. So when he's in Albany, he goes to the state capitol and searches and tries to find out what's going on. The state capitol building is largely abandoned except for, basically one office, the office of the lieutenant governor. And the lieutenant governor is the acting governor. He doesn't even know if the current governor is alive or he's been assassinated. And the lieutenant governor is just like, I'm here if the United States gets restored. He doesn't command anything. He's just kind of the skeleton of a state government who doesn't know what's going on himself and is waiting for notification from other outside parties which would constitute the United States to see if he would have power, basically. He's just one man sitting within the lieutenant governor's office and just waiting to see if America comes back on. Like, he's just sitting there waiting for America to see if it actually happens or it's fully disintegrated into feudalism. Everything else throughout the state of New York is run directly by city bosses or mafia or gangs or, feudal overlords or local towns, right? And it's just degenerated into feudalism. So then they kill the city boss, they go back to Union Grove, and then they have this celebration. Remember, the murder's not been solved yet. They have this celebration for the rescuing of the paddle boat men and the paddle boat. Stephen Bullock has a celebration. And then when they're having this celebration, Wayne Karp's gang assaults all the people that are still within Union Grove. And he breaks in as a way to intimidate Robert Earl. He breaks into his house and sexually assaults his girlfriend. So Robert Earl and then Lauren Holder, who's the constable, they try to arrest him. They get captured and tortured. And in retaliation, the cult, who has these veterans of war, then capture Wayne, bring him back to hold him on trial. In the process, the cult leader, Brother Job's son, who is part of this kind of they call them Rangers, the cult calls them Rangers, to extract Wayne Karp, he gets killed by Wayne Karp in the process. So, as revenge, Brother Job, who has supernatural powers, kills Wayne Karp under mysterious circumstances, and then the book ends. The second book, it starts off with the son of the doctor in town's pet dog gets killed by Brother Job's horse. Being 11, the boy, Jasper Copeland, poisons the horse, then runs away. And because he's been tootling under his father, he helps his father as a doctor, he thinks that he can just move to another town in upstate New York and become a doctor there, even though he's 11. So he runs away. When he runs away, he meets up with this bandit that's running around the countryside. Bandits and pickers, which are bandits that rob from people and pick abandoned houses for their valuables, are running around the countryside. It's very dangerous in this feudal society because there's no law and order to move from town to town. It's just completely lawlessness. So the boy runs away, and he gets picked up and kidnapped by this outlaw. And this bandit goes around, robs, kills people, rapes people, and the boy is tugged with him. At the same time, his father, Lauren Holder, the constable, and Robert Earl go around the county searching for the boy, and they accidentally stumble upon a child trafficker and pedophile. Lauren Holder, as the constable, frees the enslaved children and then locks away their slave master and the pedophile, who then kills himself. At the same time, Brother Job and some of his rangers are searching for the runaway child because they killed Brother Job's prized horse, his prized stallion. So Jasper ends up having to kill Billy Bones when he's raping a woman. The titular Witch of Hebron, Barbara Magel, saves her from the bandit Billy Bones. Brother Job stumbles upon him, but it turns out that Brother Job is suffering from appendicitis, and then the boy and the witch operate on Brother Job and cure him of his appendicitis, remove the appendix. Because of this, Brother Job forgives him and then hypnotizes him to kind of resolve a lot of the PTSD that he suffers following around Billy, seeing his murders, seeing his rapes, and so on. And the book ends. Now we get to the third book, and this is where, if you stayed with me, it's about to get interesting. The third book, A History of the Future, which I think is by far the weakest book of the series, it deals with what happened in the United States outside of Union Grove in upstate New York. The previous books were intentionally vague about what would happen, and I really think that that was to their advantage and to their strength. And the explanation to what happened to the United States here is really underwhelming to me. So this book is simpler than the first two books. It really only has two plots. You have Robert Earl's son, Daniel Earl, returns home, and then he has a flashback because he left upstate New York in the earlier books, and a lot of the earlier books is Robert Earl. He's sad about his son left. He doesn't know if his son is alive. His wife died of this plague, and his daughter died of this plague. And he's this bachelor, he's alone, and he's very depressed. He doesn't know what the future's going to be. So anyway, his hopes get up because his son, which left him 2 years ago, returns, and he gives this flashback describing what the rest of America looks like. And then you also have this side story, which is this quasi-courtroom drama, which centers around a woman who kills her son and husband while suffering from meningitis. Stephen Bullock, who, remember, is the magistrate, wants to have her hanged because there's no way to accommodate people that have mental illness and are killed and aren't culpable for reasons of insanity for their actions. So he just says, well, let's just hang her because we can't imprison her for safety. We have to hang her. We're just going to do it for safety. We don't have the resources to imprison her. We don't have mental hospitals anymore, basically. Then Brother Joe feels pity for her and lets her escape and harbors her in her escape. But that's, just the side plot. The main plot is Daniel Earle's story about the world that he saw around. So let's get to the backstory of the novel series, which is described here in detail in his flashback. And there's some description in the first 2 books, but really it's all fleshed out within this 3rd book. The appeal of science fiction, alternative history, and dystopian fiction is almost always a description of an alternate world within the format of the novel. But these novels are not, as I talked about before, are not that genre. They're small crime. That's their genre. So having said that, I want to go back to this and just kind of reiterate it. Kunstler is an effective and a good writer in general when he's writing about a small town crime novel. Speculative fiction just isn't his genre, and it really shows in this 3rd book. And also keep in mind that his descriptions are very simple, and I'm probably adding a lot more to them to make sense of it because I have a background in history and political science and sociology and so on. And I need to understand it and tell it to other people. I need to kind of systemize it and make sense of itself. So in the process of doing that, I'm probably adding more to it and making more sense of it than it actually does within the book. Okay, so it's important to note that this book was written during the Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria, and its bleed over in the civil war in Iraq. So his outline for this domino effect, which collapses industrial civilization, begins there. And this is what he calls the Holy Land War, which is basically the Syrian Civil War and the Iraq Civil War on steroids. The Holy Land War begins with an Iranian civil war, which spreads westwards and then collapses Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, the West Bank, and so on and so forth. As these states collapse, Israel is existentially threatened, so the United States deploys its forces into the region to maintain the existence of Israel. And the war causes a worldwide oil price spike, which destroys the entire world economy. During the war, a dirty bomb goes off in Los Angeles. Following this dirty bomb, chaos goes throughout the United States. A coup takes place, and the military takes power. And they attempt to pull back American forces from the Holy Land War and consolidate America. And then another nuclear bomb goes off in Washington, D.C. and decapitates the military government. Meanwhile, during the energy spike, all hell breaks loose around the rest of the world. Scotland declares independence from the United Kingdom, and then England attempts to deport Pakistanis within the rump state of England, I guess you would call it. And there's another nuclear bomb or a dirty bomb that goes off in Birmingham, and lots of English people die. Pakistan's defensive network gets hacked. Its nuclear weapons are proved worthless, apparently, because of this. And then India invades conventionally, and this war bogs down into something like World War I, and both states are exhausted, and then they collapse because of this huge exhaustion. Germany and Russia willingly decide to detransition into pre-industrial societies. Kunstler, of course, never explains why on earth Russia would do this, as obviously Russia is an energy superpower with natural gas and oil, and it probably has a lot of coal, and it has a pretty substantial nuclear industry. If I remember correctly, he doesn't even address France in this because France, the majority of its power is generated by nuclear reactors. There's moves within France, of course, to get rid of nuclear, but we digress. Then China intentionally decides to depopulate the entire world with an engineered virus. It vaccinates its leadership, and then it spreads the virus, which kills billions throughout the world. And this gets named the Mexican flu within New England because they don't know what's going on throughout the rest of the world, and they assume that the flu comes from Mexico. The virus decapitates much of the leadership, the educated, and it kind of facilitates this decline, this industrial decline, because really billions die in this. I think he said in China alone 1 billion people died. So he says that Japan is isolated. Nobody knows what's going on in Japan, and apparently it's radioactive. So I assume he's saying that the virus decapitated a lot of the nuclear engineers in Japan, and then they had massive reactor meltdowns. So that's what I'm assuming what he's getting at. He does say that Argentina, Norway, and Canada are able to maintain their standards of living. Canada and Argentina, they got hydroelectric power. And Canada and Norway apparently still have a lot of oil. Norway's oil allows them to unify Scandinavia into a greater federation because it has the largest remaining petroleum reserve in the world. It's offshore oil, but the book never addresses why Russia would intentionally deindustrialize, because one would assume that they have by far the greatest natural resources, especially in fossil fuel, of any country. But whatever. That's not really the focus. He's, of course, more focused on America. Within the United States, after the military government is decapitated, there is a constitutional convention of the remaining governors. These governors then elect a president among themselves. They choose the Minnesota governor. But a lot of states ultimately secede. Texas and Oklahoma form a new country of Texas. And then the greater Southeast and Appalachia secede. And then the secession falls apart, and then there's kind of like this Yugoslavian-style civil war between the whites and the blacks. The whites have control over Appalachia, the Ozarks, Virginia, and the Carolinas, while the blacks have control of the Deep South. There's population transfers as whites from the Deep South flee into Appalachia, and blacks in Appalachia flee into the Deep South. And, of course, he doesn't hesitate to make this white ethno-state in Appalachia a complete laughingstock. His white ethno-state is a Christian theocracy, the ethno-state. And apparently it's both a Christian theocracy and a white nationalist country. Both sides expel the citizens, and the whites expel the blacks expel the whites, and then they commit war crimes upon each other. So the states of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Great Plains above Oklahoma, and only of the mountain states, apparently Colorado joins them. And then this kind of rump state of the United States renames itself the Federal States of America because Washington, D.C. has been destroyed by a nuclear attack. The governor in Minnesota, who's now the president through the constitutional referendum, builds a hydropower-based city in New Columbia in Minnesota. It's implied that the Pacific states have seceded as well, but he doesn't talk about it in very much depth. He addresses my own northern mountain states. I, of course, live in Montana. So he has Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho never sending delegates to the convention. So he doesn't make it clear if they become their own country or they disintegrate into feudalism. Just going back to the long emergency, I don't understand why Kunstler poo-poos us in the mountain states so much. He says that they're too remote to, be effective in the future, and it'll be a hellscape because of how remote it will be, that it'll just decline really bad. But, Montana has some of the best land and grain production in the entire world. And, of course, Idaho has some of the best land for potato production in the entire world. And, because he has Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, the core northern, above Colorado, the red northern mountain states, right, that are overwhelmingly white, these three states. But, all three of us have huge reserves of cattle, both sheep and cows. So, also, these states were doing fine during the 19th century. I mean, Wild West is actually really exaggerated. It's kind of this legendary thing. I'm not shitting on the Western genre, but there was a lot less crime than one would think in the Western states during the 19th century, the 1800s, if you will. Is actually pretty peaceful. It's just a rural area. It wasn't anything like the cities with the huge immigrant populations. There's a lot more crime in the eastern seaboard in the United States at that time. And going back to Montana, which is the state I live in, most of the major cities in Montana are on waterways, and that's something that Kunstler talks about, the importance of having your city on a river. They're either on the Missouri, so when you think of like Great Falls, it's on the Missouri, and you think of Yellowstone, the Yellowstone River, which feeds into the Missouri. Both Billings and Bozeman are on the Yellowstone River, and a lot of other towns, so I don't really understand why he thinks Montana is like not a good place to stay. I know that we are suffering from fires, and that these fires are probably a result of global warming, and that a lot of the forests in the western part of the state are probably shifting into grassland. So that's definitely detrimental. But also, Montana has a lot of coal reserves. So does Idaho and Wyoming. So I don't know if he's just saying, well, we don't have Montana and Wyoming's coal, and so that it'll help there be this deindustrialization. The same way he kind of writes off, for some reason, Russia's natural resources and France's nuclear power. Now let's return back to the books. The first nuclear weapon, which was detonated in Los Angeles, that was from Mexico. It turns out that Mexico came under the control of a cartel, and that the cartel is now invading the United States and detonated the nuclear weapon so it can conquer the land that was lost in the Mexican-American War. And then the second nuke is kind of like blowback from that Holy Land War, that Pan-Middle Eastern War. So that's what he gives those. He says that the Packies are responsible for the Birmingham nuke. So Texas is described as losing its war against Mexico. He also talks about how Indonesian pirates seized the gold reserves which existed in California. And he doesn't explain this in any detail, but it's implied that Canada is intentionally dissolving. Because Canada, in case you don't know, a lot of Americans don't know about Canada, and most of the world, because they just assume Canada is America's hat. People always talk about the balkanization of America and the alt-right, but the reality is that Canada is much closer to balkanizing than the United States. There's, of course, the widely popular Quebec independence movement, but there's also a lot of people in Alberta that want to become independent. So apparently, Canada is like negotiating. It's dissolving, basically. There's going to dissolve into its constituent nations. So the British Columbia is going to join with these Pacific states, and then Ontario is going to join, because and this would make sense, right? Ontario is going to join with the rump state of America, the federal states of America, which are surrounding the Great Lakes, because I'm assuming that Quebec left, and that means that, it would be a lot easier for Ontario to join with the United States than to, be a landlocked country, pretty much. So anyway, there's this huge famine in that megalopolis. They call it the Northeast megalopolis between Boston and Washington, D.C., or you could say it extends to Richmond. And this huge famine causes a Malthusian catastrophe, and because, that's where the most suburban region is, they can't support themselves off food, and basically they run out of oil, they can't escape, they all starve to death, and because of this Malthusian catastrophe, that's what cuts off New England and gives them an information bubble so that they don't know what's going on. So the Midwest is generally controlled by the United States, or the successor state, the federal states of America, and they claim to New England, but New England is degenerating into feudalism because there's this huge chaos of all these people dying and starving to death in that span from Boston to Washington, D.C. So, returning back to Daniel Earl, he's trained as a Secret Service soldier for the Federal States of America, and it turns out that the white ethno-state, the methno-state, is centered in Appalachia, and it's called the Foxfire Republic. Its leader is a middle-aged woman who's a former country star. Apparently, the Foxfire Republic is a palace economy where all the resources are sent to the center and used by the elite in its capital, Franklin. There, the elite still drive cars and they have electricity. Anyway, Daniel sleeps with her as apparently she is a serial fornicator who has a thing for younger men. He then kills her and then escapes back to his father, his family in upstate New York. I just want to say this whole thing is very underwhelming and incredulous. I like how he has to have these evil racists be controlled by a country singer. So I think he thinks it's funny, but it's not very funny. It's better than the Republic of Gilead. I'll give it that. So now we move on to the fourth book, The Harrows of Spring. And this describes a communist force trying to take over Union Grove. The book is the most political of all four, I would say. This communist force is called the Berkshire People's Republic. And he really hates social justice warriors. So it's a parody of the social justice movement. And, they have a stand-in for Bernie Sanders. His name is Greengrass. So anyway, the other plot point in this, besides this onslaught of the Berkshire People's Republic, is that Robert Earl's girlfriend, Brittany's daughter, she dies at 8 years old of tetanus, and his girlfriend and him go through kind of like the spiral where they don't know, the meaning of life, that kind of thing. Like, they doubt God and so on and so forth. So let's return to the more interesting part. The Berkshire People's Republic is led by Greengrass, who's a former far-left speaker, who's a stand-in for Bernie Sanders. He's very old, and his followers are orphans. They're led by his daughter, who's an extremely butch, but, ultimately heterosexual woman named Flame. They claim to have united Vermont and West Massachusetts into a single entity, and then are moving into upstate New York to continue their unification. But it turns out that there actually is no Berkshire People's Republic. They're actually just a set of bandits who scam people into trading their paper money for silver coins. So they're claiming to be a republic, and then they're scamming people to give their silver coins for their currency, and that they're not an actual state. They're just like a roaming band of bandits. And when people don't willingly give up their coin, because in this world, the federal government's collapsed, so paper money, fiat currency doesn't work anymore, so they resort to using the coins of coin collectors, and that becomes a currency, silver and gold coins that coin collectors hoarded. So the Berkshire People's Republic is trying to force people to give up silver and gold coins, and if they don't give them up for their supposed paper currency, then they have a fake group of white men who dress up and LARP as Indians, and then they have this autistic guy that's a sniper that kills their cattle, and the people that dress up as Indians, they burn down, their farmhouses and kill their cattle. So ultimately, the town forms a militia. The cult and the town work together to form this militia, and they find out that Greengrass wasn't actually alive, and he was just this taxidermied or mummified corpse that was just being used to bamboozle people into thinking that they're a real political movement. And then the various children that were under Flame are adopted by the community, and then one of these children is adopted by Robert and Brittany after Brittany's daughter died of tetanus. And then Daniel starts an independent press and finds a girlfriend who is also his reporter for his independent press, and the book ends. So overall, I think Kunstler's strong point here is the characterization and world building he does through all these books. His fictional town of Union Grove is really well done, I think. And the characters, they really grow. You have the same characters in every book, and they grow organically. They have really good character development. He's really good at intertwining multiple plot threads at the same time. And these plot threads, they actually intertwine over multiple books throughout the series. So he's really good at building each book off of each other. That's really his strength. He's also really thought through of the culture of what this deindustrial society would be, how they scavenge technology, what they're going to do for entertainment, and he kind of like tries to build together what they would eat, like their food culture. There's a lot of focus on the food culture of it, which is interesting. Now let's get to the weak points. He's really bad at world building outside of upstate New York. In the first books, he doesn't do this, and that's really to the strength of the first two books, because they're vague, and then you as a reader is left to fill in the blanks of what's going on throughout the rest of the world. And that's kind of a problem. So in the first two books, it seems kind of dumb that all this would happen simply from peak oil. But so, like in the third book, he explains there's also this virus that killed billions. That actually killed billions. He talks about the Mexican flu in the first two books, but then he really says, it killed billions around the world, and it decapitated leaderships and educated people and so on. Because, peak oil would probably shift you permanently towards a collapse or a decline, but as, like Limits of Growth talks about, once you hit peak oil, then you start shifting into electric cars with lithium batteries. You try and turn coal into coke, and then you try to repurpose stuff to run off natural gas. So it would extend, after you would have a peak oil, it would extend for decades, then you'd have peak natural gas, peak coal, peak lithium, and so on until society collapses. So we really needed that genetically engineered plague for it to collapse that fast, instead of it being like a staircase, which Greer, and to be fair to Kunstler talks about, he has it to be a fast slap collapse. So that's fun. I mean, it's more interesting, and he wants to describe the world of a full course collapse instead of, diminishing living standards and describing that. He wants it to be, this is the end, this is the full collapse. So that's fair to him. Now getting back to this, I'm a Christian, a Catholic, and I generally don't like to have sex scenes in my media. Even in my novels, I don't like it. And this is really a downside to me. Kunstler includes a lot of sex scenes, and he has a lot of affairs. So in the first book, Lauren Holder is impotent, and his wife Jane Ann has this shaky open marriage, and he's sleeping with his best friend Robert Earl. It just doesn't make any sense, and it's really gross. The New Faith Brotherhood sleeps around a lot. So all these Christian characters are like sluttier than all the normal characters. In the second book, he has a sex scene between an 11-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl. The plot of the third book hinges around an affair between a 51-year-old woman and a 19-year-old man. He sexualizes an SJW feminist with Flame in the fourth book, and she has a bunch of sex scenes. And I don't think I'm being too prudish when I say that I didn't enjoy this, because TV Tropes complains about it as well. The reality is, I live in Montana. People in small towns do sleep around. But the way that they're sleeping around in here is kind of exaggerated. And a lot of these things are, fetishistic. This fetishistic thing of, like, this tall, manly woman with flame. And then, like, the 15-year-old, or the 19-year-old boy with the 51-year-old woman. And then, like, these two preteens having sex and open marriages. And then in the fourth book, there's, like Robert is like discussing with his son Daniel about his son sleeping with Brittany so that she can have a child. So like there's like casual incest discussed and like cuckolding, and it's like voluntary. It's just weird. It just doesn't fit, and it's just gross. Like you would think that if we lost the ability to have hormonal contraception, and that there's very few barium methods that would be left, that people would sleep around less, but these people are probably sluttier than normal Americans. Again, I already said this, these books aren't as bad with it as like something like The Handmaid's Tale is, but they have a really weak understanding of Christianity. And Kunstler is a secular Jew, so you would expect that. In fact, for a secular Jew, he has rather a bright view of Christianity compared to most of them. So the majority of the characters in the book are bitter atheists who are mad at God for allowing industrial society to collapse. Suffice to say that the world he describes is actually more atheistic than modern America, and even the world that exists in the Northeast, I would say. And as you know, people in difficult situations tend to believe in God more, not less. Ironically, something that's kind of interesting is he makes Lauren Holder into this really liberal Christian. And that's actually realistic for the Congregational Church, or, it's also called the United Church of Christ, because it's probably the most liberal Christian body in the world. He has it so a lot of the people that join the New Faith Brotherhood are cynical, and that they do it for communal reasons. Like, they're just in the cult to eat, basically. So those two, there are two major Christian bodies examined in the book, and the first one's the New Faith Brotherhood, communal Christian cult, and then the second one is the Foxfire Republic, which is a theocratic dictatorship. Of course, he makes the New Faith Brotherhood really slutty. Foxfire Republic is really dumb. First off, white nationalists and evangelicals really, really hate each other. Evangelical Christians are very anti-racist. Even if churches in the South are de facto segregated, it's unthinkable that any Orthodox Christian community within America would believe that blacks are worthy of being wiped out. Also, why would a white nationalist dictatorship be led by this slutty woman? I thought that white nationalists are supposed to be racist in their ethno-state and sexist. They're only racist, apparently. They're pro-woman. They're like feminist white nationalists. I think it's supposed to be a parody of country music, and this leads to another point. Kunstler, I would say, is actually really classist. In the books, he doesn't hesitate to... I'm just going to shift on to music. He is a musician, but in the first book, he demeans heavy metal as a genre a lot. And he talks it, calls it noise. And like the character's like, good riddance, heavy metal's gone, it's wonderful. It's just weird. And then the third book, he shits on country music a lot. I know that he plays in a string band himself, and obviously Robert Earl in some aspect is supposed to stand in for him as being a fiddle player and show his love for the genre and how he thinks that if we have a de-industrial society, that his favorite genre will re-rise. But the reality is that a lot of, white American working class, their culture is really tied into country music and to a lesser extent heavy metal. So, and folk music is really like elitist. That's like really like educated, not blue collar, city type music. Even though it's called folk music, it's evolved into being this very kind of like hipsterish thing. And this is just kind of like this general cultural blind spot that Kunstler has. Because let's return to his nonfiction books. He advocates for carpet bagging, or, other people call it being a locust. And that's where Americans from the urban areas move into rural communities. In his book, he depicts, in these books, these fiction books, many of these people, they were middle class or even upper class, and then they're pushed into being subsistent farmers or so-called peasants in Union Grove. Yet this new upper class is not made up of people that grew up, with the exception of Stephen Bullock within Union Grove or upstate New York. All these upper class people, like a lot of them are from Boston or New York City. The main character himself, Robert Earl, he went from Boston. He's a locust. So these carpetbaggers that are unskilled with their hands, that work like office jobs all the time. The Witch of Hebron is from New York, and she was a model, and then she transitions, and there's this Pendergast guy, Andrew Pendergast, who was like a writer in New York, and he transitions, and he's like he's like really important in town. So all these really important characters are from the urban areas, and then they carpetbag and become kind of like the leaders of the town. And to somebody like me, that's really offensive. And it's also like stupid. Like, so you're going to have this guy he's in middle age, and he goes from being a software company executive smoothly into being a carpenter without any real training or tutelage. That's just absurd. And I know as a Montanan, there's this widespread hostility towards people from urban centers out of the state. You know, half the cars in Montana have this sticker that says no vacancy. And there's constant talk about trying to prevent Californians from moving to Montana and Idaho and Wyoming. And, you know, there's the term masshole. And there's the term carpetbagger. I mean, literally, Robert Earl, the main character, is a masshole. That's somebody that moves from Boston into upstate New York or rural New England. They're very negatively viewed. So it's just kind of stupid to see these characters as like accepted among the community, and you would expect them to be hated, especially if they became in positions of power over people that have lived there for generations. And this is just this real blind spot that Kunstler has, is that he doesn't understand that a lot of rural, at least in the books that I've read of him, I've read 6 of his books now, right? And he advocates it in all of his books. And I mean, probably for survival, it's a lot better. I'm just going to be blunt. It's probably better to live in rural, well, it is better to live in rural America in the collapse. It's just a fact. But Kunstler doesn't understand that we don't want you here either. And, you know, Kunstler originally was from New York City, but he's lived in upstate New York for decades and decades and decades and decades. So he's transitioned out of being like a carpetbagger or a masshole or something, right? But the way that he writes all these characters is just this huge blind spot, and it's just kind of like not realistic. Anyway, once you get past that, I would say that the first 2 books are pretty good, and the 4th book is really good as well. The 3rd book, as I talked about before, has a lot of problems. He's not very good at geopolitical world building, but he's very good at world building within the small town of Union Grove. And it doesn't seem that awful to really live in. Like, it's an acceptable life. There are upsides. They have, you know, festivals. Apparently they eat a lot better. I will say that, like, small town crime books aren't my genre, but he does a very good job at writing these books. And again, these books are free if you have a subscription to Audible, so you can just listen to them if you have the subscription. So if you do, I would suggest these books. They're pretty entertaining, and especially the first book, just to kind of like give you a picture of what a fully deindustrialized future would look like.